So we're going to have Brian back for this next section where we're going to start to go through a scenario. And our goal with this is to help you guys to start to think about how should you be prioritizing your land. So I'm going to turn it over to Brian.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. I'm calling this a game, and that's not just like a shameless Jedi mind trick to make you think it's going to be super interesting. I'm calling it a game because when we play games, sometimes it requires us to suspend some of our assumptions about how details fit and play across a complex scenario. And by that I mean we're gonna start really simple, and that's not any intended slight or suggestion around the fact that this is not a complex problem, but it's to illustrate concepts and to give us an opportunity to work through things. So I'm going to be switching back and forth between slides and polls for part of this. Hopefully we can make that seamless. I guess if I'm really messing things up, blow up the question and answer box and we'll try to get it fixed, and Claire can kind of route me back in the right direction. I was listening to I drive a lot. I was listening to some podcasts, and I'm assuming other people have heard this thing about giant complex problems and activities. Is, you know, how do you do something very complex? It's hard to wrap your mind around. And people say, how do you eat an elephant? Is you eat it one bite at a time. And I mean, I like it. I like the concept. I like the idea behind that. Um, it's not really from a perspective of anybody who has spent time like processing meat. I mean, because you'd end up like chewing on a toenail or something. And so I think there is a specific strategic process into how to get the most out of an elephant, if you will. And it's breaking it down into manageable parts that you can then further refine into specific things that become a usable product that you can wrap your mind around. And so that's kind of what we're going to do in this game. We're going to apply some of our principles. We're going to build our understanding, and then we're going to talk a little bit about tools that allow us to do this kind of approach in our own situation. I'd say if you have any like specific burning questions, or something that's not clear, I can try to we can see if we can try to address those. I've got a whole bunch of different things going on the screen here, so if I need to try to address something, please do. So here's our scene. Here's our game. We are working in a 250,000 acre watershed, rangeland. We'll say sagebrush rangeland situation, and our working group, if you will, is really focused on reducing the impacts of invasive annual grasses. We're going to say cheatgrass specifically because that's the one that you guys kind of rose to the top of the list. And so we're working on cheatgrass, kind of a cheatgrass working group in this 250,000 acre watershed. We're going to start with no constraints. That will become obvious in what that means as we move forward with this exercise or this game. And we're going to build from there. We're going to build our understanding of background knowledge. And then once we get to that point, I think after lunch, then we're going to start layering some constraints on and making it a little bit more realistic and a little more difficult, because of realism. So unconstrained management plan, unconstrained, just means that like everything goes, I'll say within legal limits. There are no limitations. Some people might think this of like an open decision space type situation. So one of the first things that we might want to know if we're um, talking about cheatgrass in this case, is if this is our hypothetical, square watershed. We have some areas across the landscape that are already at a high level of infestation. Some in kind of that middle ground, moderate infestation. You can define that however you want to define that. We had some discussion about sort of thresholds earlier, and then we've got this lighter color that in our watershed represents low infestation or areas that are free from cheatgrass. And we might take different approaches. We might prioritize these areas differently depending on a number of things. But so I'm going to ask you folks that. I think that's our next poll question is where would you prioritize the most important place in this landscape to start actively controlling invasive annual grasses? We're going to let this roll for a minute and see. I mean, I guess if there's enough of us and we turn the entire thing green, then maybe we've taken care of the whole problem. So there seems to be some coalescence around some areas. Keep putting your dots on there, and we'll talk about it a little bit more. If you're doing it on your phone, it's probably hard to see. I think you can zoom in if you need to like super. If you're a very precise dot placement person, then you can probably try to add that in. So it looks like we've got a number of different areas. Not a lot of folks are putting points in some of these really large, highly infested areas. This area right over here seems to be getting a lot of attention. There's kind of a mix there. There's some proactive approach in those moderate areas that might be shifting toward being dominated by annual grasses. A lot of attention in this area. So low to no infestation surrounding an area of moderate infestation. Got some folks over here that are really interested in working in some of those areas that are highly infested. I will follow up with another question, and I'm actually going to deviate from what we did earlier in practice, and I'm going to have a different type of question. Sorry to mess this up already. This one you can actually type in a response, and then I think you can give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down to elevate that response that has been submitted by yourself or by the participants in the workshop. So we're going to try this. I'll give you a couple minutes to try this. The question is, so we just looked at annual grass cover or estimated abundance of cheatgrass in that area. What additional information would be helpful beyond just annual grass or cheatgrass cover in that watershed? We'll let this kind of shake out for a minute. Once you submit your question, I think you are able to respond to other folks and give them thumbs up or thumbs down. We're getting a lot of thumbs up on species presence and native plant community presence. So a lot more information around what else is there. What else is there besides just annual grasses? And I tell you, this kind of I'm going to scroll down, see if we got any getting not that many that are getting thumbs down. We've got traffic in terms of risk for spread, dispersal, some very detailed things. What's some of the current management practices, land use types, slope rainfall, percent infestation, so details. What's the grazing practices that are present on the different sites in this large watershed? A lot of great ideas. We're going to come back and revisit some of those. There's some fire stuff. The seems to be that the primary question that folks are wondering is this a couple different ways maybe to interpret this. Is species present So I'm going to interpret that, since we said we're talking about cheatgrasses, this is what other species are potentially there. And that is kind of supported through some of these others as well. I'm going to leave that live. We might come back and check on that. But I'm gonna go back to our PowerPoint screen. I said I committed to us that I would show some examples of ways that we could use get some of this information for ourselves. Because these little artistic drawings are good for concepts, but we need to translate this into something useful and tools. There's actually a bunch of different products that are available that provide some support for folks if you're working from scratch on that give you an estimate of annual grass abundance at these broad sort of regional scales. This is one example. A number of different federal products are available. Another example, this is Working Lands for Wildlife, kind of an online tool that you can use. So there are a number of things. I think Claire shared as part of the packet links to where you can get some information around some of these tools, and if not, we will make these links available for things that you can access. And so early on, when we first started talking about Defend the Core, we really focused on annual grass abundance. And where are the places where there's a bunch of cheatgrass versus where are there places where there are not? Absolutely a critical element to this. But as you clearly indicated just now, that's really not enough to start developing a strategy for an entire landscape. So we talk a lot about recovery potential. What are the raw materials beyond just knowing which annual grasses are there and roughly how much of each of those species are there. So when we think about recovery potential, I'm going to illustrate this with another relatively simple diagram. Some of you have seen this before, but this is an attempt to further define our vegetation on these sites so that we can start being more informed about a strategy. Our x-axis from left to right, we got annual grasses down here. So free of invasive annual grasses down here to the left, high annual grasses to the right, y-axis, no desirables on the bottom. So we'll talk about that a little bit more specifically in a moment, to a high level of desirables at the top of our y-axis. So we've got this gradient going from highly invaded, highly impacted, up to really what we would think is an intact rangeland plant community. The extremes are kind of easy to think about. Intact rangelands, we don't really have to think necessarily about recovery potential as much because they are likely meeting our management objectives in that case. The plant diversity is there. The likelihood that that ecosystem is functioning in the way that it meets our management objectives across a larger scale still exists. The rules that we understand about plant community dynamics and nutrient cycling and all those things are kind of they're kind of in place. The rules haven't changed. They haven't been severely negatively impacted by the annual grasses that are present on that site. We go to the other extreme, and I've got some sort of image graphics to display this as well. We might consider it a degraded rangeland. You might call it something else. I know that feels like a negative connotation. The dreaded cheatgrass monoculture, if we want to think about it in those terms. It's really not providing the suite of ecosystem goods and services that we would expect and that would meet our management goals from a more intact sagebrush grassland community, if that's what we're specifically talking about in this situation. I would say that recovery potential is low. but that we probably need to make sure. That's something that's going to come back repeatedly from me. If not today, then at least in some of our subsequent events, where hopefully we get a chance to interact a little bit more closely with some of you, is in many cases, you might do your 70-mile-an-hour drive-by on a site, and it looks like all that is there is annual grasses. And I think once you actually get out and spend some time on the ground, you will find that if you dig down through some of that high density annual grass cover, in many cases, but not all cases, but in many cases there are suppressed perennial grasses that exist under there. But let's say we need to make sure of that. And then we've kind of got some middle ground. Some of this area here, we've got annual grasses. We also have desirable plants that exist on those sites, maybe to a somewhat higher level than we would see down in this corner. There's a lot of subtlety to this in terms of what triggers a management action if you are taking a snapshot on the ground of your plant community in these areas. So one of the key things that we have to remember, there's not a time factor to this simplified graph. And so if we see that over time our monitoring would indicate that our plant community is moving in this direction, then it may serve as a point to trigger some action from us to change our current management strategy or to take a more active approach. If we're down here in this area where there's no annual grasses and no desirables, I'm really not sure what's going on. Maybe it's a unique ecological feature on the landscape, or geological feature. Maybe there's a rock outcrop or a parking lot, or maybe there's another issue that's happening in that area. This is just to get us thinking about this balance between invasive annual grass dominance or invasion state, and this idea of recovery potential, or some of those things that you all were just pointing out in that last poll question. Speaking of a poll question, I think I'm going to go back to the poll here. Looks like we got a few more responses, but no major changes there. And so we're gonna go back to another one of the clicky diagram things. Now the question is, just out of my sheer curiosity, will you please place a point on the diagram that indicates what you think is the most common vegetation state in your management area? Wow, man, we got somebody's down in question mark land. Our numbers are starting to kind of even out there. Man, this is super interesting for me. I mean, I think about the geographic extent that you represent in terms of participants, all over a large portion of the country, and very few of you are in that sort of area that is highly degraded. Jeremy talked to, and Lindy both talked about, there's still a lot of great opportunity for us to make a difference and to be proactive and to move a large portion of the sagebrush biome in a positive direction. And I think this is really showing that. This actually makes me even more excited. If everybody had been way down in the corner, it would have been a little bit more doom and gloom. But we're going to get into some specific management tactics as we move through the day and work through some of these other portions of this diagram. I will point out that I put this question of a threshold here. We talk about thresholds a lot the question is, at what point have we potentially crossed over what we would consider to be an ecological threshold where we may have lost sufficient recovery potential for that site to recover if we're able to limit the cheatgrass impacts on that site. We're gonna get into that a little bit more this afternoon. I'm gonna go back, stop the poll. I'll keep that live if folks want to go back and continue adding to that. And we're gonna unpack this quite a bit more as we move throughout the day. So we were here. So I think we talk about leveraging ecology, and in many ways that's kind of what we're trying to do with this. So think about vegetation as a whole. I mean, we're a lot of us are range plant community type folks, and so there are a lot of other things for us to consider. But I think this is a good point for us to think about, and a good starting point. And so now we have changed. We've changed the legend here, where it's not just cheatgrass abundance. Now we've got sort of two factors in the raw materials of recovery. We've got invasion state, high cheatgrass, and then we've got recovery potential, low recovery. You'll see that this mirrors what we had earlier in terms of cheatgrass abundance. So we've got this gradient moving from highly impacted with relatively low recovery potential down to low cheatgrass and high desirables. And I think we could ask ourselves a question: is does this significantly change what you were thinking about when we just had information regarding cheatgrass abundance? I'm not going to do a poll on that. We're going to come back and follow up on that in just a minute. Let me make sure. I think we're okay. I thought there was a question that popped up. So are there tools that help us look at this balance between annual, like good guys and bad guys? Because really that's sort of what we're talking about, is relative proportion of bad guys and good guys. And a couple examples. Our friends in Oregon put together this threat-based eco-states map, and a lot of guidance that's associated with that. Originally, they had just done it for a portion of Oregon. Now it's available to folks really across the sort of the larger sagebrush biome. All remote sensing based. I will put this caveat on any of the tools that we show, is that you need to spend some time with any of these things and see how it matches up with your experience, with your knowledge, with your information, and with your data in your area. If you can access this in a number of ways. There's this SageCon landscape planning tool that allows you to kind of scroll around and look at things in there. There are other options. It's based on characterization of shrub cover, perennial grass cover, annual grass cover, and there's a conifer element to this as well. So it starts digging in a little bit more into that balance between bad guys and good guys. Sagebrush conservation design. I mean, that's really what this was intended to do, was give a biome-wide assessment. I think Jeremy kind of called it a report card to some extent. So an assessment and an evaluation over a long time period at a really large scale of you might think about it as the health or the integrity of sagebrush grasslands. This would be a starting point. This is something that's useful at very large scales, might be useful for our 250,000 acre watershed. In fact, to key in on some areas that have a lot of those primary characteristics that we're thinking about: annual grasses, sagebrush cover, perennial grass cover, and then some other scores in terms of human impact layer, and then presence or abundance of conifers and the impact they may be having. This gives us another opportunity to at least take a starting point to do some desktop exercises and some initial planning as we're thinking through this balance of invasion state and recovery potential. And then lastly, I saw a bunch of familiar names on the participant list. This one's not going to surprise you. My favorite is get out there and spend some time on the ground. And I would say probably a mixture of some of these spatial tools that are available, and also spending some time incorporating local expert knowledge or actual on the ground intentional monitoring are keys to developing and devising a plan that is the most informed that we can develop for our strategic management of annual grasses. Some things are just hard to pick up from satellites. And the other key thing that we can't really do is some of those other characteristics that were discussed earlier, is some of those interpersonal relationships and things like that might present opportunities across the landscape. We're going to simplify even further. So we started with annual grasses, and then we kind of made things a little more complex. We're thinking about good guys and bad guys. And if we look at this as a framework for thinking through what we might do in terms of strategic level thinking at a landscape scale, and again, this is still part of the game, right? We're still illustrating concepts. I know that there are subtle differences in what we would actually do from a location here to a location there. We can really simplify this a little bit more, and we can say that if our plant community is largely meeting our objectives, then our strategy is to maintain, to defend the core or to maintain those portions of a landscape that are meeting our objectives and providing the goods and services already. Just don't muck it up. Like keep doing good management and put some safeguards in place. We're gonna talk about that a little bit more later today. To keep it in that state. Improve. Yeah, if we're above this line potentially, we've got sufficient recovery potential that if we're able to limit the impacts of invasive annual grasses or cheatgrass in our model landscape, then we've still got significant opportunities. The raw materials from a plant community standpoint are there that we can see, and we should expect to see some improvement in that landscape and potentially move it more in a trajectory toward this area. And then we've expanded a little bit, contain, if we know that there are sites that are highly impacted that could potentially be acting as a source population spatially into some of those other areas that are less impacted, then containing that invasion and limiting dispersal and spread in many cases should be a key strategy for that part of the landscape. We've got restore on there because some places are highly impacted, but because of their unique position within the landscape, we're going to talk about this a little bit more as the day goes on. It may make sense to invest in restoring those parts of the landscape. So, and when I say restore, I'm thinking that it's to the point that we have to actively and intentionally reintroduce or seed or plant desirable species back onto that site. I'm not thinking, if there's enough stuff to recover, good stuff to recover on its own, if we're able to control annual grasses, I think about that more as an improvement or a weed control type project than I do a full-on restoration project. I know there's some differences around that language. And then accept. It's a hard one to swallow. That's a tough pill for us to think about it swallowing. But there's some places where we may not have sufficient resources, knowledge, or technology currently. I'll throw that out there currently, for that to be feasible. Not going to say that it's impossible, but there may be some places where it just literally does not make sense for us to invest highly until we get better or more efficient or more effective at doing plant community restoration in a consistent way. A lot of great work being done in that area. A lot of highly intelligent, dedicated people working on that. I am convinced that we're gonna do better as we continue to learn more. But our highest leverage investment is not simply focusing in those areas and putting all of our eggs in the restoration basket while the invasion continues to shift more and more of these acres in that direction. And that's gonna really flavor a lot of the rest of today. And so if we take this theoretical framework, which is, yeah, it's partly theoretical, but I think it's very realistic in terms of wrapping our mind around these strategies. And then we move this onto the landscape that we're working with in our game. As we can then start saying, all right, we've got our invasion states and our recovery potential. And then we're going to start attaching some management strategies. So if we're in that high cheatgrass, low recovery, we might be thinking about restoring. That would really be our strategy. It's either restoring or accepting some of those areas. Along the edges, we might be implementing a containment strategy to keep those high density cheatgrass infestations from moving farther out. If we're in that moderate cheatgrass but we still have sufficient recovery potential, we might consider those improve areas. We're gonna intentionally and actively work to improve those sites because they have sufficient opportunity for us to do that. We might also implement some containment strategies at the borders of those improve and maintain areas. But I think you can see, hopefully from this example, that we can start to assign approaches or strategies to our theoretical landscape, knowing some relatively basic parts of information. I may just check in to see, Claire, if there's any questions that have popped up that I need to try to address, or are we okay?
One I have would be is how do you define / determine recovery potential?
Yeah, great question. So I would, I might have to follow up. I'm not sure who asked it, but I think there's a few different ways to approach that question. If you are able to determine that there are sufficient established perennial plants on a site, that if you can reduce the annual grass impacts, that site has the potential to recover on its own after it has access to those resources. I think that would be like a general definition of recovery potential. I think the person might be asking a little bit more like, how do we know there are enough perennial existing plants on a site that that we can assess recovery potential? I'm trying to pull open the Q&A or the chat to see if I'm misreading that. Let's see. Yeah, so the specific values question. I mean, I could waffle and say it depends. There have been numbers thrown around in the past. I mean, I think back to like the 70s, 80s, and 90s. There was a lot of work done in the Great Basin. There was a paper in the late 90s, 96 or 97, where Mike Pellant had summarized, who was retired from the BLN now, had summarized a lot of the information around like how many bunch grasses or shrubs do you need to have adequate resilience or ability to recover from a cheatgrass infestation, and to still have some kind of ability to provide what you would want from that site. And the number was much lower than I thought, and it was, like 3 perennial grasses or shrubs per square meter, which is, I mean, if you're talking about like 3 basin wild rye, that's pretty much covering the entire square meter. If you're talking about 3 sandberg bluegrass plants, my guess is that would not be enough. And so it's gonna be ecological site and regionally specific in terms of having some recovery potential. And it's also going to differ depending on the plant community type you have. You have a bunch of rhizomatous grasses, thick spike wheatgrass or western wheatgrass, that are on a site that are able to recover when those resources become available. Then it might look pretty bad at the time that you plan to go out there and start doing some management. But I think that we've seen that some of those plants have a higher propensity to spread and expand and increase in volume and cover, relative in a quick time frame relative to bunch grasses. I mean, the other thing I would say that is difficult, and that is much more difficult to pin down, is another raw material of recovery potential, could be the existing seed bank of desirable plants. And you could do seed bank assays to try to germinate out and determine what kind of seeds still exist on the site and see what kind of potential you may have there. It's more difficult. You have to make sure that it would be compatible with whatever your annual grass control methods were. But I think those are some of the, I am very hesitant to just put a number out there and say, if you have this many desirable perennials on a site, you have sufficient recovery potential. A lot of science still going around identifying those thresholds. But I'm not sure that we're there yet. I'm also not, I'm not overconfident enough to say that I have the answer, and we've got a great list of other panelists to see if anybody wanted to pick up and add something to the answer to that question, or maybe something that I missed, or refine that at all.
Brian, this is Jane. One thing I would add is, uh, you know, spray a test strip in an area that you think is pretty representative of the situations you're dealing with. For, the majority of the areas that you're dealing with, is like treat a test strip and see what comes back. I've been pleasantly surprised when I've done some of my research, the resilience of the plants, the perennial plants that are there, especially if I'm in a system where it's a mix of bunch and rhizomatous perennial grasses. So
Great,
that's what I would add.
great suggestion. Dip your toe in it if you're planning on using some herbicides. Just dip your toe in there and see what you get. Fantastic. Thank you, Jane. Jeremy unmuted, and then maybe we'll go to Paul.
Sure. My answer is there is no one number, and anyone who tells you they have one is wrong. That's because the heterogeneity of the West, everything's very, very diverse, and it's changing. It's not static either. So, a simpler answer, going back to my old days when I learned when to seed and not to seed, coming from the Great Basin, it was like, if you can step from perennial grass to perennial grass, you might have minimally enough. If you can't, we might talk about seeding. That's just an old school range con rule of thumb, but this is back to the leveraging ecology. It's a calculated risk of like, how are you going to keep out the invasives that are there? Obviously, the more perennials you have, the better, but bare ground isn't our enemy either. Bare ground is really hard for these invasive annuals to germinate in. And so think of bare ground as partly your friend in some regions. Thanks.
Yeah, great comment. Thank you. Paul.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, great stuff. I'll underscore what others have said already. I like Jane's suggestion of a test strip. In addition, ask around. I've worked with some folks who have worked in various parts of the rangeland west for many years, and like Brian, I'm going to be a little hesitant to just throw out numbers, but some of the folks with experience on the ground have shared with me, if I have X% perennial grasses in these areas, I'm not afraid to do A, B, and C. If I don't have that, I'm a little more cautious. Here in northeastern Nevada, we've got some great stuff in ecological site descriptions, the states and transitions, where density of deep-rooted, not just all perennial bunch grasses, but deep-rooted perennial bunch grasses have been used to get folks an idea of recovery potential. But underscore what all the other panelists have said about, local information, but don't be afraid to ask around. Folks have been working in these systems for quite a bit, and you may be surprised what you'll learn.
Yeah, thank you all. Wait, participants, we haven't met Dr. Paul Myman yet. Paul's part of our core team, University of Nevada at Reno. We're going to hear much more from him later today. Just a part of the great team that's working here. I saw a question about the litter comment. We will talk about that a little bit more as we work through some of the management things this afternoon. But quick answer is, most of the invasive annual grasses are facilitated by a litter layer, and germination and then subsequent establishment and persistence does better for them with higher amounts of litter, or even if you want to consider it thatch on a site. That's the short answer. And in places where, there's been a number of studies done through the years where they physically remove that litter, and survival, especially in some of those harsh winter conditions of those seedlings, when it's acting as a true winter annual, is a little bit lower on sites without that litter layer. We'll come back and talk about that a little bit more. So now we got, things are starting to get real, right? We're getting somewhere. We've got our watershed. Remember, this is kind of a game. We've got our watershed. Now we kind of have at least a high level strategic approach that we could implement in each of those different parts of the watershed. Now it's going to get really real for a second. If we assume, now this is part of all right, we're playing a game here. Remember, don't start throwing stuff at me. If we assume some costs on a per acre basis of these different management strategies, maintain, improve, contain, restore, and then we have these acreages across our watershed, then we can kind of see relative investments of what it would take for us to do this whole project. Okay, 50 cents an acre for maintain. That might include things like survey, monitoring, maybe ensuring that we're doing proper grazing, incorporating some remote sensing products. Improve, one thing we could do and improve, not the only thing. One thing we could do is herbicides. We make an assumption of about $100 an acre. It's high. Things are expensive. Helicopter fuel these days is more expensive than it was not too long ago. And then just for ease of math, I doubled that for restoration, considering seeding. And then that gets us to this. In terms of project planning, we can talk in theoretical ecological space all we want to, but if we're talking about rolling up our sleeves and getting things done and making some strategic investments and improvements across the landscape, if we were to do everything, remember, we're not constrained here. We got all the help we need. We've got all the funding we need. Then our full management package for this, if we implemented the strategic approaches, contain, restore, improve, and maintain that we talked about before, this is how that checkbook might balance across this landscape that we're playing this game in. First thought that I had when we were putting these hypothetical numbers together is, man, that's a lot of money. That's not cheap. And we've got some recent experience working on some economic impacts analyses related just to cheatgrass, well, to annual grasses alone. It causes significant economic losses across the sagebrush biome, specifically in the state of Wyoming, just as an example. I mean, just from grazing losses alone, we're losing somewhere between $30 and $50 million a year in the state of Wyoming, just from reduced grazing capacity. And I would argue that we're one of the lower abundance cheatgrass states in the western U.S. And so it's a big number. It's a striking number. I don't know how many of you have that type of funding and the capacity to do that laying around. But if you did, then you've got a plan. You've at least got a starting point, a high-level strategic plan that you can then start to operationalize across this 250,000 acres that you would be working in. I'm gonna stop there. The next steps that we're gonna have after our lunch break are we're gonna start talking about when you don't have $16 million and you have to be more strategic and you have to prioritize where you can invest in those places that it's going to do the most good. But what I will say, I'm gonna go back here to this one, is even if you're under constraints, it doesn't mean that you don't have a plan. If you can develop a strategy and articulate it across your management landscape, you've kind of established your general strategy, and then you have to work through the constraints after that. Early on in our process, Jeremy liked to talk about things like you manage every acre, or you have a plan for every acre, and this thought process helps you do that. You don't see the word necessarily ignore up there, or nah, we're good, we don't have to worry about that area. There is some kind of action, and that may just be keeping an eye on places, monitoring those areas, but there's some kind of action or at least thought process associated with every part of that landscape, and then we can start to break that down to operationalize it.
Perfect. So your first question is going to be, is there a soil/landform pattern that correlates to levels of invasion?
Soil and landform patterns. So like our south-facing, coarse textured soils, more susceptible to invasion than others. I'm assuming is maybe the what that question is asking. You know what? I think there probably is. I think there's some literature available that would indicate some of those relationships. And we're actually gonna talk about that a little bit in the section after lunch. And what you're thinking about is really is susceptibility to invasion and dominance or risk. And there are some neat tools that are available to help us with that. I think I probably hit on some of the keys if I were just going to say like which sites, but I mean, we know that south and southwest facing aspects in many cases seem to be more susceptible. We're gonna dig into that a little bit further after lunch. Great question. So absolutely, soils and topography matter.
Okay, our next question is in your presentation, you talked about some of like the GIS spatial data. Are those files available for download? If so, where?
Yeah, we've got some links to some of those on the Imagine website, invasivegrasses.com, and were some of them included in the packet, or am I just making that up?
It'll be in the packet in the spatial, so it'll be, I believe it's pages 2 through 4. So you should be able to have access to some of them. I don't know if you can specifically download all the GIS files for that, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, I would say that most of the ones that I will show today or that I have shown today, you can access you can download those and use them in your own preferred spatial analysis packet where you're using QGIS or ArcGIS or whatever it is, and use those in planning. If you're not like a geospatial type person, I will say that there's been a lot of advancement in sort of click and scroll, zoom in and out type interfaces online that you can use them to explore some of those relationships as well. So I think if you really want to dig in and do some modeling and some special planning with your own spatial data, most of these are available for download from whichever organization produces those. And if you're not, you should be able to still use them in an online format of one or another.
All right, so our next question is going to be, can you attribute specific values to low versus moderate versus high cheatgrass? Are these or are these values related to each other?
Oh man, it just kind of gets back into that numbers. Like it's hard to pin down a specific number. If we look at some of the published literature and some of the things that are coming out, all right, don't everybody write down this number and say, oh, the guys on the webinar said if we get this much number, we're moving from low to high. Okay, please don't do that. Somebody record that I said please don't do that. It seems like somewhere in that 15 to 25% range is where we really start up. 15 to 25% absolute cover of annual grasses, specifically cheatgrass, seems to be a break point where in many of our Western ecosystems, we start to see negative impacts to the desirable plant community. So that would probably, that's kind of a loose breakpoint we use when we start considering like low to impacted. And then high is it's gonna be somewhere above that. It's gonna vary so much whether you're in the Great Basin or in sort of the transitional Great Plains grasslands. So I think local knowledge and maybe some other data that would indicate that you start seeing a downward trend in good guys at some level is probably things to consider. Like I said, I was a little hesitant to put that out there, but Jane is gonna correct me.
No, I'm not going to correct you. I agree with you. I would like to add that cover production of annual grasses can vary greatly from year to year. So I would encourage people to not just focus on annual grass, and this is across all species we're talking about. Don't just focus on what is the annual grass cover this year. If there's a way to do some monitoring or look at maybe some time lapse information from some of these databases to get kind of an average cover over, maybe a 3 to 5 year period or 3 year period, perhaps.
Yeah, thank you, Jane. And Claire just shared a link. There's a lot of discussion around ratios. I know we published a paper looking for structural thresholds using ratios because we thought it might transfer across ecological sites. Great question and great comments. Jeremy's got his hand up still.
Yeah, I was just going to add that that paper that I just passed along, we are looking at using ratios rather than specific cover values to map out some of the recovery potential space that Brian has presented here. And we have the ability with things like the rangeland analysis platform to use multiple years so that we can kind of get that ebb and flow of annuals, right? If you drive out on any one piece of ground in a given year, it may be it will likely be misrepresentative of what the average condition is. So we're looking at that. I will say that the Oregon eco-state maps that Brian showed actually include that concept in those mapping states as these ratios. So people are already kind of using that rather than maybe a specific cover break.
Thank you. All right, we have time for one more question. How do we contain things on borders?
I'm not sure how to interpret borders.
I think it means like the transition zones in your map, where you had.
Okay,
contained
so
bombing.
like from a transition from like improve to maintain
Yeah.
kind of thing. Yeah, I think that's a great question. We're going to talk about that a little bit more when we get into management tactics. It probably depends on species too. So we don't. There's not a lot of empirical data associated with cheatgrass dispersal. Wind dispersal is likely pretty low, and so single like tens of meters, if not less than that. And so I think being aware of that interface is one, that border, and being active, especially if we're thinking about a high invasion, low recovery state that might be immediately adjacent to an intact rangeland, is I would think about actively controlling along those borders to prevent that kind of slow dispersal and diffusion into those less invaded core type areas. You would probably also think about things like pathways of dispersal and predictable pathways of potential dispersal, roads, trails, places where vehicles or humans might move those seeds from one place to another. I think it is likely that wildlife moves some of these seeds around and maybe livestock. And so I think that's a more difficult thing to think about in terms of preventing movement into some of those areas. But I think we're gonna try to touch on that a little bit more as we move into our management tactics
Mhm.
around 1:30 or so.
Yes.